The day he turned 18, his father told him to pack his things and be gone by sundown. There was no shouting, no broken plates, just a quiet, steady voice that felt heavier than any storm rolling over the plains. The old farmhouse stood against the wind like it always had, boards faded gray, porch sagging in the middle, fields stretching wide and dry beyond it. He had worked those fields since he could walk straight. He had bled in them, sweated in them, learned the rhythm of sunup and sundown in them. And now he was standing in the yard with a single canvas bag at his feet, trying to understand how a home could close its door so easily. "You're a man now?" his father had said. "Time to find your own ground." It sounded noble when spoken that way, like something carved into a courthouse wall. But there was no land offered with it, no horse saddled and waiting, no savings tucked into his palm. Just the dirt road leading away from the only life he had known. He did not argue. Pride runs deep in young men raised under wide skies. He nodded once, lifted his bag, and walked. The wind followed him down the road as if it, too, wanted to see what would become of him. By nightfall, he reached the edge of the property line, where the fields gave way to rock and brush. That was when he remembered the letter. It had arrived a week before his birthday, sealed with an old county stamp and written in stiff legal words he barely understood. Something about an inheritance from a distant relative he had never met. Something about land, though not the kind anyone fought over. His father had laughed when he read it. "A cave," the old man had said, shaking his head. "A useless hole in a mountain, that's what you've been left. Not worth the ink it took to write that paper." At the time, he had laughed too. A cave did not plow fields, it did not grow corn. It did not shelter cattle from the winter wind. In this part of the country, land meant soil you could turn with a blade and faith in the rain. A cave was just stone and darkness. Now, standing with nowhere else to go, that useless cave was the only thing in the world that belonged to him. The deed had rough directions scribbled on the back. Follow the dry creek bed west. Look for a split pine tree. Climb the ridge until the rock face shows white in the sun. He walked until his legs trembled and the light turned gold. When he finally saw it, he stopped in his tracks. The mountain rose like a wall from the earth, pale and cracked, catching the last fire of daylight. At its base yawned a wide, black opening. It was not a small hollow you could crawl into. It was tall enough to swallow a wagon hole. The entrance curved inward like a mouth frozen mid-breath. He felt small standing there. A few scraggly trees clung to the slope. The ground was scattered with loose stone. There was no stream nearby, no barn, no fence. Just wind and rock in that dark, waiting hollow. This was his inheritance. He stepped closer, boots crunching against gravel. The air near the entrance felt cooler, like stepping into the shade of a deep porch. He peered inside, but the light only reached so far. Beyond that, the cave swallowed everything. Most men would have turned around. In town, folks would say a cave like that was trouble. They would whisper about wild animals, or worse. They would tell him he was a fool to think anything good could come from a place like that. But he was 18, freshly cut loose, and pride is a stubborn companion. If this cave was all he had, then he would stand inside it and call it his own. He gathered dry brush and built a small fire just outside the entrance. The flames flickered against the rock, throwing shadows that danced like restless spirits. He sat on a flat stone and stared into the darkness, thinking about the fields he would not walk at dawn, the house where his boots would no longer rest by the door. The night grew colder. The stars spilled across the sky in numbers too great to count. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out. He felt alone in a way he never had before, even when working the farthest corner of his father's land. Yet beneath the ache in his chest, there was something else, a thin, quiet spark. No one had chosen this cave for him. No one expected anything from it. It was dismissed, forgotten, laughed at, and because of that it was free from opinions, free from the weight of tradition, free from the old ways that said a man must follow the same furrow his father cut before him. He rose, picked up a burning branch, and stepped inside. The cave stretched farther than he imagined. The ceiling arched high, blackened by time. The walls were rough, but solid. The floor sloped gently inward before leveling out. As he walked, the sound of his boots echoed back at him, hollow and steady. The air smelled of earth and stone, not rot. It was dry, surprisingly dry and cool. He lifted the branch higher and saw something that made him pause. Along the left wall, near the entrance, the rock had a natural curve that formed a shallow alcove. It looked almost like a room shaped by chance. He ran his hand along it, feeling the texture. The stone was strong. It did not crumble under pressure. He moved deeper. Farther in, he heard the faint drip of water. Following the sound, he found a narrow crack where moisture seeped slowly into a shallow basin formed by the rock. Not a rushing stream, but steady, reliable. His mind began to shift. All his life, he had been told what land was for. Soil was for planting, pasture was for grazing, barns were for storing grain, but stone could be shaped. Darkness could be lit. Cool air could preserve food better than any wooden cellar. He lowered himself onto a rock and stared into the dim glow of the branch. What if the cave was not useless? What if everyone else simply could not see it? The next morning he returned to town. He did not announce grand plans. He did not boast about his inheritance. He went to the general store and bought a shovel, a pickaxe, and a coil of rope. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow when he asked about lantern oil. "Planning to dig yourself a well?" the man asked. "Something like that," he replied. By afternoon, he was back at the mountain. The first days were nothing but labor. He cleared loose stones from the entrance. He dragged brush away to reduce the risk of fire. He widened a narrow path leading up the slope so that it could one day handle more than just a man on foot. His hands blistered and split. His shoulders burned. But each small change made the cave feel less like a wild hollow and more like ground he was claiming. At night, he slept just inside the entrance, wrapped in a thin blanket, fire glowing low. The cave held the day's coolness even when the sun beat hard outside. He began to understand its rhythm, the way sound carried, the way the air moved. On the 5th day, a pair of boys from town climbed up the ridge, curious. Word travels fast in small places. They stood at the entrance, staring. "You really living in there?" one asked. "For now," he said. They laughed, though not cruelly. Just the easy laughter of those who do not yet believe a thing can be serious. "Whole town says you lost your mind," the other added. He leaned on his shovel and looked past them at the distant fields. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they just can't see it yet." They shook their heads and left, kicking rocks down the path. But he kept working. Weeks passed. The entrance grew smoother. He carved shallow grooves into the stone to hold wooden beams he had hauled from discarded fence posts. With patience and stubbornness, he began shaping the alcove into a true living space. He built a rough wooden door for the outer edge, not to lock out the world, but to shield against wind and wandering animals. The steady drip of water became his greatest comfort. He widened the basin carefully, guiding the flow with small channels carved by hand. Each drop felt like proof that the mountain itself had something to offer. When the first heavy rain came, he stood inside and listened. The storm pounded the rock face, but within the cave he remained dry. The temperature barely shifted, no leaking roof, no walls shaking under the wind, just stone holding firm. He began to see more than shelter. He pictured rows of shelves carved into the walls, cool enough to store produce long after summer faded. He imagined a workspace deeper inside, safe from weather, where tools could be shaped and repaired. He thought about travelers passing through the region, needing a place to rest. The main road was not far from the ridge. With the right signs and a steady hand, he could turn the cave into something no one else had thought possible. Each idea felt wild at first. But wild ideas are often the first step toward change. In town, talk grew louder. Some called him stubborn. Others called him foolish. A few began to watch more closely. They noticed he was not begging for work, not drifting away. He was building, slowly, piece by piece, into the mountain itself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the rock face gold, his father climbed the ridge. The old man stood at the entrance, hat in hand, eyes scanning the changes, the cleared path, the wooden beams, the faint glow of lantern light inside. "You've been busy," he said. He nodded, unsure what else to offer. His father stepped a few paces into the cave, listening to the echo of his own boots. He looked at the carved alcove, the widened basin of water, the stacked stones forming a rough wall to divide space. "Still just a hole in the mountain," the old man muttered. "Maybe," he replied quietly. "Or maybe it's something else." The two stood there in the dim light, years of unspoken words hanging between them. At last his father turned to leave. "You've got grit," the old man said without looking back. "Just hope you've got sense." When he was alone again, he stared deeper into the cave, beyond the parts he had shaped. There were passages he had not yet explored, tunnels that curved into darkness. The mountain held more than he could see from the entrance. And somewhere in that unseen depth, he felt it, a possibility bigger than shelter, bigger than storage. Something that could change not just his life, but the way the whole town looked at that ridge. He lifted his lantern and took a slow step forward, toward a narrow passage he had avoided until now. The air grew cooler. The ceiling dipped lower before rising again. The sound of dripping water grew louder, steadier. As he rounded a bend, the lantern light flickered against something unexpected, something that made him stop cold. He raised the flame higher, heart pounding, staring into the dark heart of the mountain, realizing that the useless cave might be hiding far more than anyone had ever imagined. And if he was right, the town that laughed at him would soon have no choice but to climb that ridge and see for themselves. The lantern flame trembled in his hand as he stared at the back wall of the narrow chamber. At first he thought it was just another fold of stone, another shadow shaped by chance. But the light caught on straight lines, not natural cracks. Clean edges, there, carved into the rock, were marks. He stepped closer, heart thudding so loud he could hear it over the steady drip of water. The marks were faint and worn by time, but they were not random. They formed patterns, shallow grooves etched into the wall, a square outline, a series of small notches running alongside it. Tool marks. Someone had been here before him. The air suddenly felt different, not just cool and damp, but watchful. He turned slowly, lifting the lantern toward the ceiling and then toward the floor. The chamber widened slightly to the right. On the ground, half buried under dust and small stones, lay something that did not belong to the mountain. He knelt and brushed it clear with his hand. It was a rusted hinge. The metal was old, pitted and dark, but solid. It had once been fastened to something heavy, a door maybe. A lid. He swallowed and looked back at the carved square on the wall. It was roughly the height of a man's chest, wider than his shoulders. A doorway sealed with stone. He stood there for a long time, trying to steady his breathing. If there had once been a door here, then someone had built something inside this mountain. Not a simple camp, not a shelter from a storm, something planned, something hidden. He forced himself to step back. He was alone. Night was creeping in outside. The lantern oil was low. Charging ahead in the dark would be foolish. He was not afraid of hard work, but he respected the weight of stone and the risk of moving it wrong. Still, as he walked back toward the entrance, the image of that carved square burned in his mind. The next morning he returned to town earlier than usual. He moved with a quiet urgency that caught the attention of those who watched him pass. He went straight to the small courthouse building, where records were kept in tall wooden cabinets that smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk behind the desk looked up in surprise. "Back already?" she asked. "Thought you'd be settled in your mountain palace by now. I need to see the old land records," he said. "As far back as they go?" She studied him for a moment, then shrugged and pointed toward the filing cabinets. "Don't mix them up. Some of those deeds are older than this building." He spent hours flipping through brittle pages, transfers of land, survey maps drawn in faded ink, names he did not recognize. Finally, he found the original record tied to the mountain ridge. The land had once belonged to a man who arrived in the region nearly 50 years ago, during a rush of settlers looking for opportunity. The file described him as a prospector. He had claimed the ridge but never filed any official report of gold or silver. After a few years, he vanished from the records. No sale. No heirs listed at the time. Just a note that taxes had gone unpaid. The property had passed through county hands, then eventually to the distant relative who had left it to him. A prospector. The word settled into his thoughts like a stone in water. If someone had carved a door into the back of that cave, it could have been for storage, for tools, for ore. For something valuable. He closed the file and thanked the clerk. Outside, the town looked the same as it always had. Wagons creaked along the main road, dust swirled in lazy circles. Men gathered near the feed store, talking crops and weather. But he felt as if he were carrying a secret that hummed beneath his skin. Back at the cave, he did not go straight to the hidden chamber. Instead, he stood at the entrance and studied the rock face around it. If someone had worked inside, there might be signs outside as well. He walked the slope slowly, scanning for unnatural lines or disturbed ground. Near a cluster of low shrubs, he found a patch where the earth felt harder under his boots. Kneeling, he scraped away dirt with the edge of his shovel. After a few inches, the metal struck something solid. Wood. He cleared more soil, revealing the corner of a wooden crate. The boards were rotted in places, but the shape was clear. He worked carefully, exposing the lid. Faded lettering could still be seen, though much of it had worn away. He made out only a few letters, enough to suggest it had once carried supplies from a far-off city. The crate was empty. Still, it proved someone had stored materials here. The cave had not been forgotten as long as the town believed. As the sun climbed higher, he returned inside and made his way back to the carved square. This time, he brought the pickaxe and a small pry bar he had borrowed from a neighbor under the excuse of reinforcing beams. He set the lantern down and ran his hand along the outline. The stone that filled the square was slightly different in color from the surrounding wall, as if it had been placed there rather than formed naturally. He tapped it gently with the metal end of the pry bar. The sound that echoed back was hollow. His pulse quickened. He began chipping at the edges, working slowly to avoid loosening more rock than necessary. Small fragments fell away, clinking against the floor. The dust filled the air, catching in his throat. The work was slow, steady, and careful. He did not want the mountain collapsing on him because of impatience. After hours of effort, a thin crack appeared along one side of the square. He wedged the pry bar into it and leaned his weight against the metal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the stone shifted. Not much, just enough to confirm it was separate from the wall behind it. He froze, listening for any rumble or warning from the rock above. There was none. Only the drip of water and his own breathing. He eased back, wiping sweat from his brow. Whatever lay beyond that sealed opening had been hidden deliberately. The prospector might have built a small chamber. Or he might have found something already there and chosen to conceal it. The thought sent a chill through him. He worked until the lantern burned low again. By then, the crack was wide enough to see darkness beyond the stone. Not solid rock, empty space. He left it there for the night, replacing a loose slab in front of the opening to keep animals from wandering too close. As he lay near the entrance, staring up at the thin slice of stars visible beyond the door, his mind refused to rest. If there was a hidden room, what did it hold? Tools long abandoned, or that had never been hauled to town. Or something more complicated. The next day, he noticed he was no longer alone on the ridge. A man from town stood near the path, pretending to examine the view. He tipped his hat as he approached. "Been hearing a lot of hammering," the man said. "Curious what you're building up here. Just making it livable," he replied. The man's eyes drifted toward the cave entrance. "Funny place to settle. Unless you know something the rest of us don't?" There it was, suspicion. "Don't know much of anything," he said evenly. "Just trying to make do with what I've got." The man lingered a moment longer, then nodded and walked back down the path. But the message was clear. Word of his digging had spread. That afternoon, his father returned again. This time he did not step inside. He remained at the entrance, arms crossed. "Folks are talking," the old man said. "Saying you're chasing ghosts of some old prospector. Hoping to strike it rich." He met his father's gaze. "Maybe I am?" The old man's jaw tightened. "Riches have a way of bringing trouble. This town's steady because we keep things simple. Farming, trade, hard work. You start digging for more, you stir things up." He wanted to say that being kicked out had already stirred things up, that he had nothing left to lose. But he held his tongue. "I'm not hurting anyone," he said quietly. His father studied him, then looked past him into the cave's dim interior. "Just be careful what you uncover," he muttered. "Some things are buried for a reason." When he was alone again, those words lingered. That evening he returned to the sealed opening with renewed determination. He widened the crack little by little until the stone block loosened enough to shift under steady pressure. With a final push, it tipped forward and fell onto the cave floor with a heavy thud that echoed through the chamber. Dust billowed around him. He coughed, waving it away with his sleeve. The lantern light spilled through the opening, revealing a narrow passage beyond, not natural like the rest of the cave. The walls were smoother, shaped by tools. The ceiling lower, forcing him to bow his head slightly as he stepped through. The air inside felt colder, stiller. He moved slowly, lantern held high. The passage extended only a few yards before opening into a small room carved entirely from stone. In the center stood a wooden table, its legs thick and sturdy despite age. Along one wall, shelves had been cut directly into the rock, and on those shelves sat objects wrapped in cloth, untouched by decades of dust. He did not reach for them right away. Instead, he stood in the doorway of the hidden chamber, listening to the silence. His mind raced with questions. Why hide this room? Why seal it behind stone? What had the prospector feared enough to conceal so carefully? Outside, the wind picked up, moaning faintly at the cave entrance. Down in town, people would be finishing supper, unaware of what lay beneath the mountain ridge they passed every day without a second thought. He stepped forward at last, lifting the lantern closer to the nearest wrapped bundle. His fingers hovered inches away, knowing that once he touched it, whatever mystery the cave had been guarding would begin to unfold. And deep down he understood that the moment he unwrapped what sat on those shelves, nothing about his quiet fight to prove that the useless cave had value would ever be simple again. His fingers closed around the edge of the cloth, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening to his own breath move in and out. The mountain felt like it was holding its breath with him. He told himself it was just old supplies, maybe tools left behind by a prospector who never struck anything worth staying for. Still, his hands trembled as he pulled the fabric back. Underneath lay a stack of leather-bound journals. The leather was cracked with age, but the pages inside looked carefully preserved. He lifted the top one and brushed away a thin layer of dust. On the inside cover, written in faded ink, was a date from nearly 50 years ago. Below it, a name he recognized from the courthouse records. He sat down at the stone table and opened the first journal. The handwriting was tight and steady. It spoke of long days surveying the ridge, of digging small shafts into the rock, of testing samples. It mentioned veins running through the mountain, not of gold like most men dreamed about, but of something else. A mineral rare enough to fetch attention from buyers far beyond the county line. The prospector wrote about its strength, its unusual properties, and the way it ran deep through the stone like a hidden backbone. His pulse quickened as he turned the pages. The entries grew more urgent over time. The prospector described visitors climbing the ridge, asking questions, offering to buy the claim outright. He wrote about refusing them, about wanting to prove the value of the discovery on his own. Then the tone shifted. There were mentions of threats disguised as friendly advice, of pressure from men in town who preferred things quiet and predictable. One entry stopped him cold. If they cannot control it, they will try to bury it. He closed the journal slowly and looked around the hidden room again. The shelves held more than just notebooks. Beneath another cloth bundle, he found small samples of rock, each labeled and wrapped carefully. He lifted one and held it under the lantern light. Thin streaks of dark mineral ran through pale stone, almost shimmering when the flame flickered. He was no expert, but he knew enough to understand that something valuable might be woven into the mountain he now called his own. He also understood why the room had been sealed. If word spread that the cave held more than shelter, the quiet ridge would not stay quiet for long. He replaced the journal exactly where he found it and sat back against the cold stone wall. The main conflict he had been fighting, proving that the useless cave had worth, had just grown larger than pride. It was no longer about showing his father he could build something from nothing. It was about deciding what to do with knowledge that could change the town's future. Down below, life followed its usual rhythm. Crops were planted, deals were made with handshakes. Families counted on steady seasons and familiar faces. A mineral rush could turn that steadiness upside down. Strangers would arrive. Land values would shift. Old friendships could fracture under pressure. He thought of his father's warning. Riches have a way of bringing trouble. But another voice whispered beneath that caution, "You were handed a mountain? What you build from it is your choice." The next morning, he went about his usual work as if nothing had changed. He reinforced beams at the entrance. He carved out additional shelves in the main chamber. He made sure anyone watching would see only a young man trying to turn stone into shelter. Yet inside, his thoughts churned. In town, whispers continued. At the general store, two men stopped talking when he entered. He caught fragments of conversation about the ridge, about hammering echoing through the hills at night. Someone joked that he would dig himself into China. Laughter followed, but it sounded strained. The clerk from the courthouse approached him quietly near the flour barrels. "You found what you were looking for in those records?" she asked. "Maybe," he said carefully. She studied his face, then lowered her voice. "Be cautious. The prospector you read about did not just vanish from paper. Folks said he packed up and left in a hurry. Others said he did not leave at all." He held her gaze. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "It was years ago. But my grandfather used to say there were men who wanted that ridge more than they let on." When the prospector stopped coming to town, nobody asked too many questions. A chill ran through him that had nothing to do with the cave's cool air. He walked back up the ridge that afternoon with sharper eyes scanning the path behind him. He had always felt alone on the mountain, but now he wondered how many times he had been watched without knowing it. At the cave, he went straight to the hidden room and read deeper into the journals. The prospector wrote about testing the mineral's strength, about sending small samples to a contact in a distant city. One letter, copied into the journal, mentioned industrial uses, potential contracts, and the promise of wealth beyond farming or cattle. Then came a final series of entries that grew frantic. He wrote about being followed, about offers turning into demands, about fear that the ridge would be taken from him by force or by law. The last entry ended mid-sentence. He traced the unfinished line with his finger. What had happened after that? He explored the hidden chamber more thoroughly, tapping walls and checking for additional spaces. Behind one shelf he found a small metal box bolted into the rock. It was locked. The metal was thick and showed no sign of rust, as if the dry cave air had preserved it. He tried to lift it, but it would not budge. Whatever lay inside had been important enough to secure. As he examined the lock, a faint sound drifted from the outer cave, a scuff of boots on stone. He froze. The lantern flame flickered as he lowered it and moved silently toward the passage. From the main chamber came the distinct scrape of wood against rock. Someone was inside. He stepped into the shadows near the entrance of the hidden passage and waited. Two figures stood near the alcove he had shaped into a living space. They were not boys this time. They were grown men from town, broad-shouldered and careful in their movements. One ran his hand along the beam he had installed. The other studied the floor. "See," one muttered. "Told you he was digging more than just a bed." "He ain't got the tools for serious mining," the other replied. "But he's up to something." His jaw tightened. This was exactly what the prospector had feared. Curiosity turning into suspicion. Suspicion turning into claim. He stepped out into the lantern light deliberately, making his presence known. "You looking for something?" he asked evenly. Both men stiffened and turned. "Just checking in," the first said with a thin smile. "Heard you might need help up here? I didn't ask for any." The second man glanced deeper into the cave, eyes narrowing at the shadows beyond. "Mountain don't belong to you alone," he said. "Town has a stake in what happens around it." He held his ground. "I've got the deed. For now," the first replied quietly. The words hung in the air, heavier than any threat shouted outright. After a tense moment, the men tipped their hats and left, boots crunching loudly down the path. He waited until their footsteps faded before exhaling. The conflict was no longer hidden in journals. It was standing at his doorway. That night, he did not sleep near the entrance. He moved deeper into the cave, closer to the sealed chamber, and kept the lantern burning low. Every small sound felt amplified. The drip of water echoed like distant steps. The wind at the entrance sounded like whispered conversation. He thought about telling his father the truth, about showing him the journals, the mineral samples, the locked box, but trust was fragile between them. If his father believed the cave held wealth, Would he protect his son or try to claim part of it for the family farm? He did not know. In town, another subplot was quietly unfolding. The clerk who had warned him found herself questioned by one of the men who had visited the cave. They asked what he had been searching for in the records. She answered vaguely, but unease settled over her as well. The ridge was becoming a topic at supper tables and in hushed talks near the church steps. Meanwhile, he began testing small chips of the dark mineral himself. Using tools from the prospector's hidden table, he struck them against steel, tested their weight in his palm, even tried heating a fragment carefully to see how it reacted. Each test hinted at strength and resilience beyond ordinary rock. The more he learned, the clearer the stakes became. If he revealed the discovery, he could transform his life and perhaps the town's future. New jobs, new roads, prosperity beyond the narrow limits of dry fields. But he could also invite greed, legal battles, even danger. The prospector's final unfinished sentence felt like a warning carved into stone. One evening, as he stood at the cave entrance watching the sun sink behind the hills, his father approached once more. The old man looked tired, lines deeper around his eyes. "Town council's been talking," he said without greeting. "They're considering reviewing old land claims, making sure everything's proper." He felt the ground shift beneath him, though he stood still. "My deed is proper. They say the ridge was once tied to a larger tract. Might argue it belongs to the community." He met his father's gaze. "Do you believe that?" The old man hesitated. "I believe men do strange things when they think something valuable is at stake." The wind tugged at their jackets. The cave behind him felt both like a refuge and a trap. "I won't give it up," he said quietly. His father studied him long and hard. "Then you better be ready for what comes with keeping it." As darkness fell, he returned to the hidden chamber and sat before the locked metal box. The journals lay open beside him, their pages whispering of ambition and fear. Outside, the town he had grown up in was slowly turning its attention toward the mountain. He ran his fingers over the cold metal of the lock, knowing that whatever lay inside could tip the balance. Proof of the mineral's value. Legal documents. Evidence of the prospector's fate. Above him, the mountain stood silent, holding its secrets. And below, pressure was building, not just in stone, but in the hearts of men who had begun to realize that the so-called useless cave might hold the kind of power that changes everything. He sat in the hidden chamber long after the lantern burned low, staring at the locked metal box bolted into the stone. The journals lay open beside him, their pages filled with warnings written by a man who had once stood in this very spot, full of hope and then full of fear. The weight of it pressed on his chest. This was no longer about proving a stubborn point to his father. It was about survival, ownership, and the kind of future he wanted to build. By morning, the air in town felt different. He could sense it before anyone spoke. Men stood in tighter circles. Conversations paused when he passed. Even the usual sounds of wagons and livestock felt muted, as if the entire place was holding something back. The ridge was no longer just a rocky backdrop. It had become a rumor with teeth. At the general store, he overheard enough to understand that the town council had indeed called a meeting. Words like land review, mineral rights, and community interest floated through the air. He kept his face calm, but inside his thoughts moved fast. If they tried to challenge his deed, he would need proof. Not just pride and a shovel. He would need something solid enough to stand in front of a room full of men and make them listen. That metal box in the hidden chamber began to feel less like a mystery and more like a lifeline. When he returned to the cave, he did not waste time. He brought heavier tools this time, careful not to draw attention on the path. He waited until dusk, when the ridge fell into shadow and most eyes were turned toward supper tables and oil lamps. Inside the hidden room, he knelt in front of the box and studied the lock more closely. It was old but sturdy, designed to resist more than a casual hand. He did not want to break it outright. If there were documents inside, he needed them intact. He examined the hinges, then the bolts anchoring it to the wall. The metal had been set deep into the stone. Whoever placed it there intended it to stay. He worked slowly, using the pry bar to test the edges. After a long while, he realized the box itself might not need to be forced open if he could remove it entirely. If he could detach it from the wall, he could take it somewhere safer to examine. The thought of carrying it down the ridge in daylight made his stomach tighten. Too many eyes, too many questions. Still, time was running short. The next day, a notice was nailed to a post near the church. The town council would meet in 3 days to discuss claims on the ridge and surrounding land. Attendance strongly encouraged. He read the words twice, 3 days. That evening, his father climbed the ridge again. There was no small talk this time. "They're serious," the old man said. "Some of the larger landowners think that if there's mineral value up here, it belongs to everyone." He studied his father's face, trying to read where he stood. "And you?" The old man hesitated. "I think a man ought to keep what's legally his, but I also know this town. Fear spreads faster than truth. They'll say you're hiding something." He looked toward the cave entrance, then back at his father. "What if I am?" Silence stretched between them. His father's eyes narrowed slightly. "You found something." He did not answer directly. "If I show them proof that this mountain has value, they'll want a piece. If I hide it, they'll take it anyway." "I'm caught either way." The old man exhaled slowly. "Then you better choose your ground carefully. You stand up there in that meeting empty-handed, they'll bury you in talk. You walk in with something solid, you might shake them." The advice was simple, but it carried weight. For the first time since being told to pack his bag, he felt his father standing beside him rather than across from him. That night, they worked together in silence. His father held the lantern while he chipped carefully around the bolts anchoring the metal box to the rock. Dust coated their sleeves. The sound of metal scraping stone echoed in the chamber, but neither man spoke of what might happen if someone heard. At last, with a final shift of pressure, one bolt loosened, then another. The box sagged slightly in its frame. They lowered it gently to the stone floor. It was heavier than it looked. They carried it to the main chamber and set it near the alcove he had shaped into a living space. His father wiped sweat from his brow and stared at the object as if it might explode. "You going to open it now?" he asked. He nodded. Using a small chisel, he worked at the lock carefully, not smashing but prying with patience. After several tense minutes, the mechanism gave with a sharp click that echoed through the cave. Both men froze. No footsteps followed. No shadows appeared at the entrance. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay a stack of folded documents tied with string, along with a small leather pouch. He set the pouch aside and focused on the papers first. They were contracts, letters, and a detailed survey map of the ridge. The map showed markings far beyond what he had explored, indicating veins of the rare mineral running deeper and wider than he had imagined. One document stood out. It was a draft agreement between the prospector and a company based in a distant city. The terms outlined a partnership that would have brought equipment, workers, and a formal claim recognized beyond the county. It was unsigned, but it proved that outside interest had once been serious. His father leaned closer. "This is proof," he murmured. "Proof of value," he replied. "And proof that someone tried to take it?" He opened the leather pouch next. Inside were small, polished pieces of the dark mineral, shaped and smoothed. Even in the dim lantern light, they caught a faint sheen. Along with them was a simple gold ring, worn thin. Perhaps the prospector's, a reminder that he had been more than a rumor in old records. They sat in silence, absorbing what lay before them. "If you show this at the meeting," his father said slowly, "you'll light a fire under every man in town. I know. And if you don't, they'll assume the worst." The mountain no longer felt like a private struggle. It felt like the center of a storm gathering strength. The next day, more men climbed the ridge uninvited. This time they did not step inside, but they stood near the entrance, studying the rock face and the cleared path. He met them outside, arms folded. "Council's meeting soon," one called out. "Be smart about this." "I plan to be," he replied. They left without further words, but the tension lingered long after their boots disappeared down the slope. Inside the cave, he prepared carefully. He moved the journals and documents back into the hidden chamber temporarily, keeping only the survey map and one letter in the metal box near the entrance. He did not want everything exposed at once. The main conflict was not just about ownership. It was about control of information. He also began reinforcing the cave's entrance more solidly. Not to keep townsfolk out, but to protect against sudden moves made in fear or greed. Each beam he secured felt like a statement. This mountain is not abandoned. It is claimed and cared for. On the eve of the meeting, the sky darkened with heavy clouds. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance. He stood at the entrance, watching the horizon. Storms had a way of clearing the air, but they could also cause damage before the calm returned. His father joined him again, this time without words. They both knew that tomorrow would decide more than just a legal claim. It would shape how the town saw him. As a reckless boy chasing riches, or as a man who had turned a so-called useless cave into something real. As night fell, a figure appeared on the path below, moving quickly despite the rising wind. It was the clerk from the courthouse. She reached the entrance breathless. "They're planning to vote before you even speak," she said urgently. "Some of them want to declare the ridge communal land first thing." His jaw tightened. "Can they do that? They'll try?" Thunder cracked overhead, closer now. He looked back into the cave, toward the hidden chamber where the journals and the rest of the evidence waited. The metal box sat near his feet, containing just enough proof to make a statement. The storm broke then, rain slamming against the rock face. Water rushed down the slope, but inside the cave, they remained dry, solid, protected. He felt the truth of it settle deep inside him. This mountain was strong. The cave was not a useless hole. It was shelter, resource, history, and future bound together in stone. Tomorrow, he would walk into that meeting carrying proof that the ridge held rare mineral veins and documented interest from beyond their small town. He would stand before men who once laughed and show them that vision and hard work could turn forgotten land into opportunity. But as lightning lit up the sky and thunder shook the ground, he also understood that once he revealed what lay inside the mountain, there would be no turning back. The storm raged on, echoing through the cave like a warning and a promise at the same time. And at the heart of it all, with the metal box at his feet and the weight of the town pressing in, he knew the next sunrise would bring the most intense moment of his life. By the time the storm passed, the sky over the ridge looked washed clean. The air felt sharper, clearer, as if the mountain itself had decided it was time for truth. He did not sleep that night. At first light, he dressed in his cleanest shirt, placed the survey map and selected documents back into the metal box, and closed the lid with steady hands. His father stood near the entrance watching him. "You ready?" the old man asked. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm going anyway." They walked down the ridge together. The path that once felt lonely now felt like a line drawn between two worlds. At the bottom, townsfolk were already gathering near the church hall where the council meetings were held. Eyes followed him as he approached, the metal box carried firmly in both hands. Inside, the room buzzed with low conversation. The council sat at a long wooden table at the front. Some faces were stern, others curious. A few were openly skeptical. The council leader cleared his throat. "We are here to discuss the status of the ridge property and any claims regarding mineral rights and land ownership." He stepped forward before they could move to vote. "I'd like to speak first." There was a murmur, but the leader nodded. He set the metal box on the table and opened it carefully. The sound of the latch lifting seemed louder than it should have been. "I was left a cave," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Most of you called it useless, a hole in a mountain. I almost believed that myself." He pulled out the survey map and laid it flat. The detailed markings caught immediate attention. Men leaned forward. Whispers broke out. "This ridge was studied decades ago by a prospector who discovered rare mineral veins running through the rock. He documented it. He contacted outside partners. He prepared contracts. He held up one of the letters. He did not leave because there was nothing here. He left because pressure and fear forced him out." Silence filled the room. "I found his journals sealed behind stone inside the cave. I found this map and these agreements locked away. The value of that mountain is real, but so is the risk." One of the larger landowners stood abruptly. "If that's true, then the town has a right to share in it. We can't let one young man control something that could change everything." He met the man's gaze. "I'm not asking to control everything. I'm asking to keep what's legally mine." He turned to the clerk who had taken a seat near the side. "You've seen the records? The deed is valid. She nodded. It is. He continued, if we turn the ridge into a fight, we lose more than we gain. Greed will tear this town apart faster than any drought. But if we handle it right, if we approach this as a partnership instead of a takeover, we all stand to benefit. The room shifted. The word partnership hung in the air. His father stepped forward then, something few expected. My son was kicked out at 18 with nothing but a bag and a deed to a cave we all laughed at. He didn't run, he didn't beg. He worked that stone with his own hands. If there's value up there, he uncovered it through grit and sweat. That counts for something? The council leader leaned back, studying the map. What exactly are you proposing? He took a breath. This was the moment that would decide everything. I keep ownership of the cave and the ridge as stated in the deed. In return, I form a local partnership. Jobs go first to people from this town. Any outside company we bring in signs agreements that protect our land and our way of life. No reckless digging, no tearing up fields, controlled development. Fair shares, the larger landowner frowned. And why should we trust you to manage something that big? He did not look away. Because I live here, because I don't want to see this place destroyed. And because I have proof that this can be done right? He lifted one of the prospector's journals. The man before me tried to do it alone, that's where he failed. I'm not trying to repeat that mistake. The council members exchanged glances. The tension in the room felt thick, but it was no longer sharp with hostility. It was thoughtful now, measured. After a long pause, the leader spoke again. We'll need to verify these documents. But until then, no vote will be taken to strip the land from you. A quiet wave of relief moved through him, though he kept his expression steady. And if the documents hold, the leader continued, we will consider a formal partnership under strict town oversight. It was not a full victory, not yet, but it was enough. Over the next weeks, everything moved carefully. The documents were reviewed by legal minds from a nearby city. The mineral samples were tested and confirmed valuable. News spread beyond the town, but because the information came through official channels rather than rumor, it did not spiral out of control. True to his word, he insisted that any outside company sign agreements prioritizing local workers and sustainable methods. The cave itself remained the heart of operations. Instead of blasting open the mountain, they reinforced tunnels carefully and used measured extraction techniques. The rare mineral was valuable, but the land mattered more. The so-called useless cave transformed before everyone's eyes. The main chamber became a secure storage and planning space. The hidden room was preserved as a reminder of the past, the journals kept safe as part of the ridge's history. The steady drip of water was channeled into a small system that supplied clean water to workers on site. Men who once mocked the idea of living in a cave now climbed the ridge daily for work. Young people who once planned to leave town for opportunity began staying. Wages improved. New businesses opened along the main road to support the growing activity. Through it all, he stayed grounded. He still slept in the alcove he had carved in the early days. He still walked the ridge at sunset, remembering what it felt like to stand there alone with nothing but doubt and wind for company. His father visited often now, not as a critic but as a partner in quiet conversations about growth and responsibility. One evening, as they watched workers head down the slope, the old man spoke softly. I was wrong about that cave, he smiled faintly. Most people were. I wasn't wrong about one thing, his father added. You had grit. He looked at the mountain face glowing in the evening light. Grit's only useful if you use it. The clerk from the courthouse eventually joined the operations team, helping manage records and contracts. She once admitted that watching the ridge transform had restored her faith in small towns adapting without losing themselves. The larger landowner who had challenged him became one of the strongest supporters of the partnership after seeing fair returns and steady growth. Suspicion turned into respect once transparency replaced secrecy. As for the mystery of the original prospector, the journals were published in part, honoring his work and acknowledging the pressure he faced. A small plaque was placed inside the cave near the hidden chamber, telling his story. It felt right to give him a place in the new chapter of the ridge. The rare mineral continued to draw interest, but strict agreements kept development balanced. The mountain was not stripped bare. It was managed carefully, its strength respected. Years later, people would still tell the story of the boy kicked out at 18 who inherited a useless cave. They would stand at the entrance, now reinforced and welcoming, and shake their heads in disbelief at how wrong they had been. He never forgot the first night he sat by the small fire outside that dark opening, feeling abandoned and unsure. That memory kept him humble. It reminded him that value is often hidden where others refuse to look. The cave had not just provided wealth. It had revealed character, tested loyalty, and forced a community to choose between fear and cooperation. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the ridge, he stood at the entrance once more. Workers had gone home. The air was calm. He ran his hand along the stone, feeling the same cool surface that once felt like nothing more than rock. Now it felt like proof. Proof that being kicked out at 18 did not mean the end. Proof that a so-called useless cave could hold opportunity beyond imagination. Proof that hard work, vision, and steady courage could turn doubt into respect. The mountain remained solid behind him, no longer a dark unknown but a foundation. And as he looked out over the town that had once questioned him, he knew the greatest thing he had built was not wealth or contracts or even a thriving partnership. It was trust. The cave still stood there, carved by time and strengthened by human hands, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful inheritance is not what you are given, but what you choose to see in it.